Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Liner Learning and Lunch, which, as you may know, has been focused on the 7 deadly sins. Now, I want to remind you, before we get to, I believe, the 7th that we have covered, that these are actually not a list of Jewish sins, but they're helpful for organizing thoughts around sin in general and around the Jewish tradition in particular. And so we've used them as a sort of framework, especially because, as I've told you before, I found this book helpful and interesting, The 7 Deadly Sins, Jewish, Christian, and Classical Reflections on Human Nature by Solomon Schimmel. However, it's important to say that the idea doesn't always fit perfectly into a Jewish framework or into a modern framework. And so the sin I'm going to talk about today is going to cover some areas that seem not directly to the point of this sin, but they are, in fact, sin adjacent. How about that? They live in the same neighborhood as the sin. So today, with your permission, we are going to talk about a sin that is negated by your presence, which is sloth. Because if you were slothful, you would not be taking time in the middle of the day to be watching a class on Jewish concepts. And sloth is an interesting one because it doesn't just, even in classical thought and in Christian thought, it doesn't just mean laziness. It also means a certain anomie, a certain sense of meaninglessness, and even sometimes of despair. And so I want to talk about that for a few minutes and then take comments and questions. Weirdly, to moderns, but not to classical Jews, not finding meaning in life is a sin. Because if God created you, then to feel as though this life is empty is in some ways to negate your creator. And so what you find is that sloth, sadness of a certain kind, despair, are pushed back against by religious thinkers. Rabbi Nachman famously said that despair was the greatest sin, because despair means that you lack hope about the future of the world that God created. And the idea that God created a world in which there is no hope is a repudiation of God's nature and of God's self. So the first thing I want to say about sloth is that the opposite of sloth is the zealousness that seeks to do good in the world. There's a concept of zrizim lemitzvot, hurrying to do a mitzvah. Maybe the best known example to people who are not intimately involved with the tradition is, you may know that right after Yom Kippur, as soon as it's over, some people will drive in the first nail in the sukkah for Sukkot. And the idea behind that is zrizim lemitzvot, the first moment that you are able to do it, and you can't do it before Yom Kippur, you're not allowed to. First moment you are able to do it, you do it. And in our own lives, this idea that we should be awakened and eager and alert to the possibility of mitzvah is something that we see throughout the Jewish tradition. And there's a nice phrase in the Talmud that says that the virtue of the Beit Midrash, of the house of study, is in the running. In other words, it's actually your eagerness to get there that is the real merit of the event itself. And so for the Jewish tradition, sloth is a it's a turning one's back on the responsibilities of being human. Because if you sit on the couch, you don't help others, you don't pay attention to others, and you don't think that there are things for you to do in this world, then your inaction, unlike your action, becomes itself a kind of sin. Now, this is one of the things that makes sloth different from other sins, because it's a sin of inaction. But there are sins of inaction, as we know. Like if you passed somebody who was starving and you didn't give them food because you were just too damn lazy. I just can't be bothered to get out of my car and feed this person. You would say that indifference, which is kin to sloth, that laziness, that unwillingness to push yourself to do things is itself a sort of sin. Now, Clinton already anticipated something that I was going to talk about that I hadn't gotten to yet, which is that the other part of sloth that is not untrue about other sins too is a question of how much of this is related to particular mental conditions or mental illnesses. I think we could probably say that about all the sins in certain ways: pride, envy, anger, lust, gluttony, and greed. All of them, in different ways to different degrees, could be thought of as products of mental imbalances of one kind or another. But it is certainly true that sloth in particular, he talks in the chapter on sloth about clinical depression and depression, which is something, by the way, that I think some of the Hasidic masters struggle with, and they write about it. And certainly not only the Hasidic masters, but a lot of people have struggled with. Churchill called it his black dog. Churchill suffered from depression. That kind of mood disorder, or whatever you want to call it, I don't think anybody would say that suffering from it is sinful, but I think some people might say that not seeking treatment for it is, or not trying to combat it is, or not seeking in some way to re-enter the world so that, because the world needs you. I mean, if you think about it, why is it that suicide in the Jewish law is against Jewish law? It's against Jewish law for two reasons, primarily. One is that your body doesn't belong to you. It's on loan from God, and therefore you don't have the right to destroy it. But the second reason is because you're supposed to be doing good in the world, and you eliminate that possibility by eliminating yourself. And so if there is an ailment that takes you out of the world such that you can't do good in this world, it is not too dissimilar from suicide, in the sense that you remove the possibility of your doing good. Having said that, clinical depression, now we know how much of it is chemical, and so our methods of treating it are quite different from what they were in previous generations. And I think we think of it less as a blameworthy thing than maybe some of our ancestors did. I certainly hope so. However, healthy-mindedness is still a Jewish virtue. And the attempt to be, I was going to first of all say the attempt to be alive and contribute and so on is praiseworthy, but it is more than that. Judaism is known as a culture of accomplishment. And it is a culture of accomplishment in part because of this belief that a life lived sitting alone in contemplation in a mountaintop is not a good life. And that's not the same as other religious traditions. Other religious traditions will say to you, this is a very holy man who sat on this mountaintop for 40 years and spent his time exploring himself. understanding his soul, communing with God. That's in Christianity. There were eremites. There were these hermits who lived by themselves for years and years and years and years. Certainly in Buddhism, that exists. I can't speak to Islamic tradition, but in Judaism, it doesn't. In Judaism, somebody who goes off by themselves for an extended period of time, not for a short period of time. For a short period of time, such self-examination is often praised. But for an extended period of time, they're considered to have betrayed the community because the community needs them. And therefore, sloth, which is not having the energy to be part of it, to contribute and so on, is not considered a positive characteristic. Now, as I say, this differs from religious tradition to religious tradition. And I don't want to sit here and make the comment and make the case that Judaism is right and others are wrong. It's a different system. I will let you judge it on your own. Now, I do want to say something about grief, not only because Marla said something about it, but also because Judaism has a very particular attitude towards grief. And that is, grieving is essential and important and limited. Limited. You're not allowed to say the Kaddish for your parents for more than 11 months, even if you want to. You're not allowed to sit Shiva for more than 7 days, even if you want to. And the reason is obvious, because Judaism thinks that it is essential that life be for the living, and that you are not allowed to die with the person who has died, even metaphorically. You can't say my life is over because this person has passed away. It's going to be hard. It's going to be wrenching. The loss won't ever go away, but that doesn't mean that the person has to go away who remains, which is why after the funeral, you have a Sudat Ha'avara, a meal of transition, because you're going from the cemetery back to life. And that's an essential part of this cycle, the way God created the world. And it is, as I said, it's not exactly sloth, but it is related to sloth in a certain sense, because it is an abdication of your responsibility to be engaged with other human beings if you don't rejoin the community after you've suffered some kind of great loss. So those are some of the aspects of sloth that I wanted to bring to your attention. And I think that in a way, it reminds us that the same thing is true, that the same thing is true, that is true of other sins that we've looked at, which is that there is no sin that isn't on a continuum, that isn't on a spectrum where some manifestation of it is or can be a good thing. So, for example, gluttony is bad, but eating food is good. Greed is bad, but ambition is good. On and on and on and on. And here, the idea is that sloth is bad, but balance and perspective are good. People who go running around, as all of our grandparents used to say, or many of them, at least my grandparents used to say it, like a chicken with its head cut off, which is a pretty pretty graphic and very farmyardy image. I have actually never had the displeasure of seeing a chicken run around with its head cut off, but one can only imagine. The point is, aimlessly, I suppose, that idea that you would have energy for energy's sake, but not do anything that is productive and helpful, and that you don't have a balance where you also have rest and so on. That's, that reminds us that sloth is on a continuum. And sometimes for some of us, that I want to read you something that I just saw the other day, which I thought was really quite wonderful, that somebody put on Twitter or whatever. It said, European out of offices. I'm away camping for the summer. Email again in September. American out of offices. I've left the office for 2 hours to undergo kidney surgery, but you can reach me on my cell anytime. Someone put that on Twitter and then reposted it. And I just thought that was perfect in some ways, because the truth is that Americans do tend to think of any time that you spend in idleness as bad somehow and slothful. But Judaism does actually seek balance, and therefore allows, for example, for the grieving person to be out of the community for a while. And when you ask, does Judaism allow for intense grief over years? In one sense, yes, and in another sense, no. It allows you to feel it. It doesn't say you can't feel that grief, but it does not allow you to withdraw from society or to cease contributing, because there is an egotism to grief that is important to overcome, by which I mean, you're not the only person that ever lost. As painful as it is, loss is the iron law of life. And if everyone who lost withdrew from the world would collapse. And so, yeah, there is a little bit of pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and start all over again, in the words of the old song. And Judaism does put a real limit on mourning, and will not allow people to go on mourning forever. So I do think that sloth has something to say to us, but it varies person to person, family to family, and even community to community. I would say that the tendency, for example, to sit in front of the television hour after hour after hour after hour, and not to do anything that is really growthful or improving, or helpful to other human beings. You may not want to use the word sin, but it sure as heck ain't good. It's not a good way for someone to live their life, and it's not a good model to give to one's kids, and it's not going to make a society better or the kind that we want to live in. So a certain energy and eagerness is a powerful moral quality, and to believe in the potential of the world to be improved and engaged with is, I think, central to the kind of society that all of us want to live in. Just imagine if our ancestors had not worked hard, I mean, there are so many examples. There's so many examples that I don't even know where to start. But just imagine if the vaccinators had decided not to work. They said, I'm tired. Let somebody else do a vaccine. Bobby is exactly correct. Lo alecha hamacha ligmor. It's not on you to complete the work, but you aren't free to desist from it. You have to do everything, but you have to do something. Because if you don't do something, if you don't work at it, then you're leaving the world in its current fallen state. Fallen not in the theological sense, but fallen in the practical sense. I mean, let's take something like I'm trying to think of a crisis that everyone can agree on, even though I'm sure there is no such crisis that everyone can agree on. But if you want to take climate change, take climate change. If you want to take political polarization, take political polarization, whatever it is, okay? COVID, whatever it is. Without human energy and initiative and work, it's not going to get better. It's not going to get better. Gregory Bateson, who was a philosopher, his daughter said to him once, "Why is it that my room gets dirty but never gets clean?" Right? This is the law of entropy. Things fall apart, they don't fall together. If you leave fundamental problems alone, not like I have a toothache and it might be better in a week. It might not. That's possible. But fundamental problems have to be addressed. And they can't be addressed solely through prayer. They have to be addressed through human initiative. And sloth is the enemy of initiative. And therefore, it is the antagonist of solving the problems that we face. And so to call it a sin is maybe not the vocabulary that we would use, but it's certainly vocabulary that makes an awful lot of sense when you think about what the alternative is. Now, I know, and I do want to pay certain attention and respect to this. I know, and I am aware of the fact that the compulsive forcing of kids into activity, and you have to get an A, or you don't matter in this world, and you have to get a good job, or you're not a real person. That some people think of that as the opposite of sloth, and that too partakes of sin, because that's a combination of pride and blindness. That the only way to be successful in this world is to do X, Y, or Z. Like the Jewish mother who's pregnant with twins, and someone says, which one is the doctor and which one is the lawyer, right? As though that's the only way that it is possible to be a success in this world. You could be lots and lots and lots of things. Sloth isn't about academic achievement. The opposite of sloth is not getting good grades. The opposite of sloth is not making a lot of money. The opposite of sloth is contributing something to the world. And let me just say, you can contribute something to the world in lots of ways. And I want to give you an example. This morning, as you might be able to tell by the fact that I'm wearing a black suit and a tie, I did a funeral. And the workers at the mortuary who dug the grave did so like with the family around, with sensitivity and kindness, and really contributed to the comfort of that family. And they were the opposite of sloth. They were doing work that really mattered, and they did it in a way that was really beautiful. So it's not a function of what work you do. It's a function of work in the world. And you're right, what Marla said first, Marla and Clinton. Gregory Bateson was Clinton's mentor. That's pretty cool. Marla's right that COVID has definitely contributed to sloth. Illness contributes to sloth in general, right? And pandemics are like sloth on steroids. But illness in general contributes to sloth. And that's why like activity is a kind of healthy mindedness. Right? Activity shows you the robust health of someone who wants to create and make and do in this world. If you look at the biblical heroes, David, Moses, Ruth, Naomi, Deborah, Abraham, they're people of enormous and almost superhuman energy and direction and daring. They're the opposite of slothful. And the tradition praises that, and so should we, because it's important. It's important to have goals. It's important to focus on them. It's important to work. It's important to be a part of a community and active in a community and contributing to a community. and not to sit and expect the world to take care of you. I suppose that it is true that if we're blessed with many years, that everybody is entitled to reach an age at which you say, I've given enough. It's time for the world to take care of me. I'm not sure that it's the most admirable attitude, but it's certainly an understandable one. But for anybody who is still capable of working for his or herself, we all know that work confers dignity, and it confers a certain sense of self-esteem, and it's important. It is important. So I guess the lesson of today is don't retire too soon. Don't be slothful. Work at whatever it is you do in a way that helps others and makes you proud. And join us for Shabbat morning. I think that's pretty much the story. Thank you. Next week, next month, next class will be the last of the 7 deadly sins. I mean, we did all 7, but we're going to talk about sin in general. And that will conclude the Liner lunch, learning and lunch for this year. And God willing, in Yirtzeh Hashem, we will be in person for this class next year. We may still broadcast it, but we will be in person this class next year and actually be able to have lunch and to learn together and to see one another in person. And that's only because the people who created the vaccines were not slothful, nor were the people who distributed them, nor were those of you who got them. But if you're one of those people who has not gotten them, get the vaccine, okay? It is clearly safe. Billions of people across the world have been vaccinated. And it actually helps stop not only the pandemic, but the variants that can develop if people are not vaccinated. So don't be slothful. Get the vaccine. And with that little peroration, I now wish you a good